Hello. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time this morning to join us as we talk about the future of active cyber defense. I'm very grateful to be joined by my dear friend and friend of the business Redsift, Kieran Martin. Many of you in the audience will probably recognize him and know him well in some capacity or the other. He's been a friend of Redsift for probably close to 5 years at this point in time. I can't
That's
remember
right.
where we first met, Kieran, but it's been a wonderful
Arguably
experience
longer,
getting.
but arguably longer, but we'll come to that.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. And very fortuitously, of course, Kieran was available to join me this morning to talk to us about the history of ACD and where we are today. So with that, why don't we move forward? If I haven't had a chance to meet you before, I'm Rahul Pawar. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Redsift. Um, as I mentioned, Kieran is with us today, talking to us about his history with the NCSE, what ACD was back when it was first envisioned as under his leadership, and where we expect it to be going in the future. Kieran, do you want to talk to the folks and say hi?
Very much so. So really excited to be here, Rahul. Thank you so much. I think the original vision of active cyber defense lives on, but it's in a new environment, and it's really important we get that environment right. There's a lot of talk at the moment around improving cyber hygiene, improving the digital environment as we adapt to the huge challenges of the AI world. And actually, I find more and more people looking back and saying, what was this thing that seemed genuinely new at the time that the UK, both in the private and public sectors, were trying to do 10 years ago, and how do we turbocharge it now? So really, really excited to be here. Great to be with you and your excellent company, Rahul, and thank you everybody for joining.
Thanks, Kieran. Okay, so let's have a quick look at the agenda. We are specifically looking at something that's quite specific and time-bound, which is the migration away from MailCheck and WebCheck, which the NCSC has announced they are retiring. Then we'll zoom out a little bit to look at the evolution of ACD over the years and what that actually means for UK public sector organizations. And then we're going to end with something a little bit more strategic, just sort of look at why are we doing any of this to begin with, and what is the role of government and government institutions in increasingly hostile cyber landscape. And hopefully we'll have some time for questions. So please pop them in the chat. And my colleague Jack, who's monitoring that, will feed them to us as we get to the end so we can have a short discussion based on the questions we receive. Okay, great. So let's start with what's changing. Of course, I'm sure most of you know this by now because, of course, you've joined this webinar, you've probably seen some of our materials, and of course, the NCSEA has been communicating this for probably about 6-7 months. But at a high level, MailCheck and WebCheck, services that the NCSEA has provided for a number of years to public sector organizations, is due to expire in about 40 days. So March 31st, every organization that's currently relying on NCSC's free mail check and web check services will lose visibility into their email authentication posture and their web health checks. So let's talk a little bit about what mail check and web check did and its reason for existence. And of course, the best person to talk about this is really Kieran.
Yeah, so thank you, Rahul. I think you framed it very well. And as you say, people who are joining this webinar will already have some knowledge of what it is and why it's being phased out. But I think the way to look back on it was to capture a sense of two things. One was we really needed to do something. There were all sorts of digital pollutants. There were all sorts of basic vulnerabilities in organizations, particularly less well-funded organizations, small businesses, and as we trailed it with small public authorities who didn't really have the tools to do it. But secondly, given that we're at this position now in 2026, we never put a time frame on when we would withdraw government support, but we felt pretty strange about doing this. We felt like we were very nervous. We was like, these are interventions that have to be made. We've got to improve the email authentication of small government authorities. We've got to help, show small businesses a way. But surely there should be commercial providers out there. Surely there should be things that we can be that can be done without government intervention. But we ended up in that classic space, as you often do in cybersecurity, where it was who's providing for the smaller entity. So we very tentatively said, look, here are some things that you can do for free that will help you, but also help the general digital environment. And that's what MailCheck was. There was back then, I think, much less maturity around people's consideration in organizations, big and small, about people's in the way they envisioned cybersecurity. They thought, what's my network, who's on it, and how do I make sure they kick them out? And they didn't go much further. And you said to them, well, what if somebody spoofs you? And of course, the tangible harm for that can be hard to detect, but there is intangible harm and there's general societal harm. But with apologies to all of you who watch, like me, the Simon Pegg movies and Hot Fuzz and so forth, trying to persuade cash-strapped public sector bodies and private organizations to do things for the greater good was always going to be somewhat tricky, even if there were tangible and intangible benefits for them. So we decided to intervene directly, but temporarily. So we said, look, here you go. This tool will help you do your basic email authentication. And the take-up was really, really rapid, and the benefits were very, very considerable. So that's why we built MailCheck. Government domains were being spoofed at unbelievable scale. I mean, the first organization we did this with, and Ed, the brilliant CISO at HMRC at the time, wrote this great blog about it, which we can put in the notes afterwards when we circulate the recording. HMRC, we looked at the whole aperture of GCHQ's cyber defense information, and we found that from our analysis, the 16th most spoofed brand in the world that we could find was HMRC, and it was the #1 most spoofed brand in the UK. That really mattered. It mattered for the digital health of the UK, but it also mattered to HMRC. It didn't stop anybody paying tax, but it did undermine trust in the tax system. And at a time when the incentive for them was to go digital, as it still is, if people were starting to mistrust communications from HMRC, the authentication of their domain really, really mattered. So what did we do? We did DMARC, we did email authentication, and what happens? Within 1 year, we collect 500 million spoof emails. That's 500 million times something didn't appear in a British citizen's laptop inbox that they had to hover over. It was magic, but it has to be put on a sustainable footing, and that's where we are now. So it was a response, direct response to an immediate and measurable threat, and we got some great outcomes. We took a risk. We perhaps intruded. Rahul, you will have a better view on this than me. We perhaps intruded on the rightful space of the private sector, but we always wanted to get out of that space as quickly as possible and put this on a self-sustaining basis.
Yeah, no, I think your characterization is very fair, because one of the things about email authentication is the massive network effects, as you well know, that happen if you do it right. So HMRC is a great poster child. I think it's probably one of the most early successful deployments of DMARC at scale, certainly at a government and state level. But in general, we know that if we do this across everything, the network effects and amplification factor that comes with it is huge. And, awareness was limited, as you suggested, certainly back then in 2017. So from the pulpit of the NCSC being able to talk about practical things that you can do to clean up this polluted digital landscape is incredibly powerful. Certainly things that private sector organizations just never have the opportunity to tell at scale.
But I think, and this goes back to my elliptical remark about how long we've been friends, because I was aware of your and other companies in this space, broadly defined, work in this sector. And I remember one of the first conversations I had, it was with one of your colleagues, not with you, but saying, well, the problem for you guys is, how do we try to make something that we in the government, because I was in the government at the time, want as a public good? How do we make it sort of commercially viable? I think back then there was a sense that it was just a general good. I think now, and I think this represents a collective success in the much vaunted public-private partnerships that we always talk about, loosely defined. We have, there is now a sense that the protection of brand is actually in your own interest, as well as in the collective interest of the country and of everybody, so that we make the UK a harder target. So I think 10 years ago, and this is I know I'm getting, you're not, but I'm getting far too sort of philosophical and almost ethereal here, Rahul. But I think 10 years ago, this felt like something that was just a wider public good. Now it does feel a maturity that it's just that there's something here that everyone should be doing as part of brand hygiene, as part of protecting just the authenticity of their digital existence. And that's a really, really good thing.
Yeah, technical controls that don't require individuals to actually make difficult and hard to sort of imagine choices on every communication is a strong part of the solution.
Yeah, and I think another point, sorry, I know I'm getting very excited because I remain passionate about this stuff, and we can see the evolution of active cyber defense. There were other things here, but I think one of the things that it was helpful for the government to try to pioneer was actually just the sense of usability. I remember the job I had before going into cybersecurity was as the director of a part of the government that, amongst all the responsibilities, it had oversight for the funding and administration of local authority elections. I got to know the local authority apparatus quite well. Later on, that was quite useful as we got worried about the cyber protection of elections and so forth. And you think of something like an election as a big national event, and in some respects it is. It's actually, in practical reality, thousands of tiny events in village halls run by tiny administrations. And I remember going to North Norfolk, where there were 3 different councils sharing one IT person. And that was always my lodestar star when I was thinking about the NCSC. It was like, right, we could give state-of-the-art capabilities to this person, give them a mind-blowing, scary report and a bunch of recommendations that were unaffordable and they wouldn't have the expertise to input. Or, as with things like mail check and so forth, you give them a really simple, or web check, and I know it's off topic today, but you give them a really simple set of tools and reports to say, look, this is fine, this is good enough, this is a bit worrying, but it's okay, you're doing well, and here's how you go about it. And that's essentially what I think the approach should be. We didn't ever, just to this slide, we never put a timeline on it. It was an aspiration. And I think I was probably right, and we were lucky that nobody forced us to put a timeline, because what was the right time? You think back to where you were in 2017. Was it 3 years, 5 years, 9 years? Who could tell at that point? But certainly that crucial point about bringing in gradually industry leaders over time. There are parts of the active cyber defense program that still really, the economics of them dictate that the state has to run them, but this isn't one of them. So I think it's really good that MailCheck and WebCheck can now essentially be devolved fully to the private market.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of that, the transition from government services, I guess the question is to what? Now, clearly ACD was designed, as you've described, to raise the bar, especially when there weren't a bunch of good private sector alternatives.
Yeah.
And your point on usability is a fair one. I remember a lot of solutions that were in the space at the time when we decided to enter it. They were incredibly consultative. They were very, very difficult for that, for example, average IT person that you're thinking about inside that local council to actually get their arms around and use, much less afford, because of the way the economics of that entire thing was set up. And I think in many ways what the NCIC did with the first version of ACD was do something that's very close to my heart, which is build usable software. Yeah. I think cybersecurity sometimes feels like it's immune to this sort of forcing function. But if tools are not easy to understand, easy to use, and to some extent pleasurable to use, people won't use them, no matter how useful they might be for whatever outcome they're designed to arrive at. So, my background is in consumer, and you can imagine that we would never ever launch anything in the consumer space that we didn't feel was in some ways useful, delightful, engaging. And I think cybersecurity probably has to take a little bit of that on. And it's safe to say over the last 10 years that has started to happen. There's some good software out there. I wouldn't say we're the only people doing that, but I think usable software is a trend that I'm extremely happy is becoming more standard in cybersecurity.
So I would wholeheartedly endorse that, and I think you and others have done a great job in this space. I also think that's helped, because if you look at, I don't know what your impression of this was, as a CEO in the private sector, but you look at the increase, by no means perfect, but increased maturity of leadership level discussions. People are asking about this. It's intelligible. It's a product that they can understand. It's a set of metrics that people can now understand in terms of what this type of capability does and what utility it has for them. And again, one of the things, and I think this slide brings it out quite well, even if it does play to my tendency to go off on highfalutin philosophical detours. I think all of us as taxpayers, and I've been in private practice for 5.5 years now, almost as long as I spent running government cybersecurity. So, as a private sector taxpayer, I want the government's elite capabilities to be focused at the elite end of the problem, having provided that baseline. If that means, as often in hard new challenges, if that means intervening directly in the market for a while, that's great. I think one of the achievements, again, to be over philosophical, one of the achievements of this, because the private sector has stepped up, both in the vendor and purchaser space, there's a tendency throughout history for temporary government interventions to become permanent. And I think it's really good to have this example that where the operational security tooling does belong in the commercial ecosystem, and government can set its cyber essentials, can set its, as it's going through now, for critical infrastructure, it's setting its new higher standards for critical service providers. But even then, they need some email authentication as well as some of the more sophisticated tooling that you might need at the higher end. So it's important about, as the heading here says, what it was never meant to be.
Great. So let's zoom in a little bit at what good looks like after MailCheck. So as Kieran's talked about, MailCheck was originally designed to provide a solid baseline with a usable interface to bring all of the public sector services in line with the recommendations of the NCSE at the time and as they've evolved over the years. So they provided good basic reporting, compliance dashboard, remediation guides, and it was mainly for, of course, public sector organizations. When you're looking at commercial services like ours, one of the things that we've been able to do as we build a commercial model on this is actually start to keep pace with the change in technology. So everyone, of course, here probably knows what DMARC is. If not, then we have a whole bunch of materials on what it is and how it's effective. But DMARC's not the only solution to a bunch of problems that exist on the public internet as it relates to cybersecurity. Over the years, we've had new standards come in place. So for example, DMARC, as we know, protects your domain from spoofing, but new standards like MTA-STS, which are also recommended by active cyber defense today, and organizations like Google, Microsoft, basically prevents your communication from being downgraded. So a man-in-the-middle attack, for example, cannot be applied against an organization that has some of these modern standards in place. So as you can see, all of these things fit together to provide a strong set of technical controls that don't require a user to intervene and actually figure out if communications are valid or being intercepted or spoofed in any meaningful way, which we think is clearly not possible at a national level. As far as I know, MailCheck never got around to implementing a bunch of these standards. So while the recommendations of the NCSE for the public sector evolved, the tooling did not really have the opportunity to catch up. Moving to some of the private solutions that are out there, such as ours, we've worked hard over the 2,000 customers or so that we have around the world to make sure that these technologies are relatively easy to deploy and easy to maintain for the lifetime of your deployment, which I think is the second part of this, which is something that people often miss. Once you're actually doing these technologies and implementing them in the real world, if you don't have continuous intelligent monitoring about what is going on and how that might impact your mail flows, you can easily have situations where your mail, for example, just stops working correctly. And that will then have significant challenges as you try and debug in your sort of busy lives how mail flows have stopped working and what the impact is and how you remediate those. So continuous monitoring, real-time alerting, and of course, for organizations that are yet to fully deploy DMARC in its enforcement mode, we have a lot of intelligence and tooling with more coming that will help people do this in an automated way. We do a lot of monitoring at internet scale. And if you've joined any of our webinars before, you've seen some data that we've shared about what good looks like across the world. But for this webinar, we went in and looked very, very closely at what gov.uk domains look like. So we just looked at domains in the gov.uk domain space that have DMARC enforcement in some way or form. So whether it's reporting or it's actually got one of the stronger authentication implementations in place. And we found that, interestingly enough, I think it's safe to say that the NCSE's push on DMARC over the last 9 years has been relatively successful. I think if you have a 50% in DMARC reject, that's surprisingly high. I think the only other place where we've seen such high stats is probably in US large retail financial organizations, which is a much smaller data set and certainly doesn't have the spread of organizations that are in the gov.uk space. However, if we zoom in a little bit more, we can see that there is still about 22% of these who are not in compliance in some way or form and still need to get there. However, if we look at just the MailCheck customers, so these are 3,540 domains that are reporting just to MailCheck. The majority of them are in reject on quarantine, which I think is excellent progress for the NCSE's efforts over the last couple of years. However, of course, come 1st April, every single one of these domains will actually lose all their visibility into their mail traffic. So these organizations that are in rejected quarantine, if there is any change in configuration, for example, someone adds a new customer engagement platform onto their organization, there will be no visibility into if those systems are actually correctly configured and working. So I don't know if there are organizations on this webinar that fall into this category, but I would strongly suggest that they restore visibility to their infrastructure before this transition happens. And there are a number of options available, us included.
And I think that takes us on a little bit to a look ahead now in terms of what's next. And I would say 3 things that in terms of the big picture. The first is I'm always a little worried in these things that I just sound like I'm stuck in 2017 and what the original intent was. Let's look at 2026. I don't believe in webinars that you should just bombard people with statistics and so forth. We want to bring out the main issues and so forth. But if you look at the annual reports every year that the NCSE has done and continue to do on the active cyber defense, the statistics about the uptake of this, but not just so much the uptake, the impact of it means that the UK is significantly better defended. Most organizations that use it are significantly better defended than they were a decade ago. But for absolutely correct reasons, that is coming to an end. So we just cannot afford individually and collectively for there to be some cliff edge drop off. That's the first thing. The second thing I think relates to the fact that there is a changing threat picture out there. I hope that people who know my work know that I don't go in for hype or FUD, as people call it in cybersecurity, and whipping up this narrative of exponentially worsening threats and so forth. And one of the reasons I try not to do that is that you do then miss when there are genuine deteriorations and changes in the threat picture. And we are in one of those moments now. We had a bad year in the UK in 2025. So did lots of other countries with lots of very, very serious economically and socially damaging criminal, mostly ransomware, disruptive ransomware attacks. And we've seen the increased use of cyber in the many heightened sets of conflicts and tensions around the world, both real in Russia and Ukraine and threatened with Volt Typhoon in China and Taiwan and so forth. And if you look at the Volt Typhoon set of threats, that's not obsessing, as the Russians sometimes do, with the exquisite, difficult, highly sophisticated attacks on complex industrial systems. It's large-scale disruptions of ordinary organizations, government organizations, small businesses, retailers, etc., the everyday services that we all depend on, because that's the impact. And that's a real and present danger. And things like mail check services are absolutely vital to stopping that early point, that first point of entry. And then the third point I'd make is that we're now And it's linked to that. We're now in a world where actors can use more automated capabilities. Again, I don't want to be a hype merchant about AI-powered cyber attacks. AI hasn't created some magical new weapons that attackers can use, but it's just made it easier and cheaper for people who already know how to do the basic exploitations to find those entry points, because they can look at it at automated scale in which human attackers cannot do, and they can exploit those. So we really need to batten down our hatches and make sure that this change doesn't lead to a disruption in the UK's overall defences. So I think, again, moving on, if we look at how we see this sort of division of responsibilities, we can look more clearly to what you will want your government to be doing and what we really need to be doing for ourselves. So you can see, perhaps it's better if I take the column on the left and Rahul can take the one on the right. You can see that we're moving to a clear space where the government is doing less as a direct provider, and that must be right. It has special legal powers and highly specialist capabilities to try to take care of the worst end of Volt Typhoon on our behalf, but it only works if it is then left to set the framework, to do the large-scale national threat intelligence sharing, to run the incident response, to give specific advice about specific threats, and to work with the Americans and others to try to take as much of this problem away. But we're not going to take, or the government is not going to take all the problem away from organizations, because each organization will have to do. Over to you, Rahul.
Yeah, at the end of the day, each organization is really have to getting down to the nuts and bolts of implementing the standards that, I think collectively we agree are the right minimum baselines for what I guess we would call sort of commercially relevant security. Obviously, there's a lot that you can do. There's a lot that you can certainly spend on cybersecurity, as Kieran, we've discussed over many years. But we do think that there is a widely accepted minimum standard that anything that's out there facing the internet now in 2026 probably needs to be considered appropriately configured for the level of risk that's out there on the internet today, especially when we're engaging with members of the public. And we have very complex supply chains, and obviously we're very deep into the journey into digital transformation. So with all of those things in place, getting the basics right, making sure the right protocols are correctly implemented and maintained over time, making sure that domain inventory is managed on a regular basis and the external attack surface is mapped out regularly, ensuring, of course, I think there was a question about PQC, and we'll just jump into that right when we get to this right at the end, but ensuring that web standards and SMTP standards are maintained and future-facing, because, of course, technology does not stand still. And we actually have appropriate reporting and remediation workflows that allow organizations to actually meet their requirements in demonstrable ways, especially when it comes to that annual audit. Of course, there is a big question. This is one of many, I think, Kieran, as we discussed before.
Yes, you would expect. We haven't just turned up here this morning and riffed on this. We've thought a great deal about what to say to you who've been kind enough to give up your time to listen to us either now or on the video later. So there's all sorts of questions, but I think we've all learned over the years that we need to, for leaders, we need to focus it into one big practical question that organizations can really interrogate. And here it is. Who owns our email authentication now that NCSC doesn't? So you've had this service. It's been great. It's been very popular. It's been very effective. The feedback has been terrific. But now it has come to an end as a free government provided service. So it's something that's in your defense playbook. It's in your assurance portfolio as something that's there. And now it's not. So how does it work now that the NCSC doesn't run it? There are all sorts of sub-questions. We debated these over many months and years about some of the sort of original market problems that led to the government intervention in the first place. So, for example, where's the liability if there's some sort of major cyber incident that at its heart is a spoofing of your brand? The honest answer to that is it's not always entirely clear. But do you want to be the organization that is at the heart of some complicated inquiry or legal case where that proposition is tested? Do you want to suffer the consequences of that? The best way of avoiding that pretty horrible scenario is to answer this question: who owns our email authentication now that the NCSC doesn't? And I think that's a vital question for organizations to answer in the next 40 days.
Yes. Is the UK public sector ready for this transition? So as some of the data that we've seen would suggest, many organizations, I'm sure many of them are very relevant organizations for the general public, haven't actually gone through and started to make any meaningful configuration changes to prepare for this change. And as a lot of people on this webinar, and certainly Kieran, we're very aware of, many of them haven't actually gone out and operated their own DMARC monitoring. Procurement cycles in governments are long, and the deadline is about 6 weeks away. So it does feel like most of the organizations that are most reliant on MailCheck aren't the ones that were prepared to replace it. And while the NCSC has provided, a reasonable amount of guidance and fair warning, I guess, about this change over the last 12 months or so, it doesn't feel like a lot has really happened. Kieran, do you have any thoughts on why this might be?
It's the last bullet on this slide. The organizations that were most reliant. This moment on MailCheck are the ones least prepared to replace it. This moment was always going to come, Rahul. The moment where an intervention designed to help those, frankly, perhaps least well placed to help themselves, would be transferred out. There are things around government procurement cycles. I know from many of my former public sector colleagues, one of the things that they one of the circumstances which they toil under, which is very unfair, but it's a reality, is that you set macro budgets, big announcement from the Chancellor, covered by all the news, live statements in Parliament. But actually, when your unit gets its money, it can be many, many months subsequent to that, and there are approvals processes and so forth. Having said all that, I think that certainly in central government, there have been reforms with the government cyber action plan, the machinery of government changes to put a central unit of excellence in the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology. So I'm hopeful that they are seized of that. I know there's a good relationship between that new unit and the NCSC. I'm hopeful that at the sort of macro central level, the government is seized of this. And what I would hope is two things. One is that the central forces in government reach out in the same spirit as they launched this scheme in the first place, to make sure that the permanent footing on which it's placed is a smooth and good transition, but also that organizations go back to that question in the previous slide: who owns this now that the NCSC doesn't? And just to ask that question, because even asking the question, if you don't quite know what the path to the answer is, it starts you on that path. And this couldn't really be more important. As we keep saying, I think it is objectively provable that the UK has benefited from this experiment, and the capabilities are there in the private sector to maintain it. We really cannot afford to slip up here. So this is it may be very esoteric. It may be something that if we were going to see our friends who work outside this space, it would take a fair bit of time to explain. But this niche bit of the cybersecurity problem is actually one of the central cogs in national cyber defense. So we've got to get this right.
Speaking of which, next steps. So yes, Mark in the chat did point out that actually report processing has stopped for a while. I think the thing they're trying to shine a light on over here is that given that report processing has stopped and actual access to the portal is effectively going to be removed very soon, there are a number of organizations that are clearly flying blind in this email authentication scenario, which means that either things are not being maintained and changes are effectively failing authentication, meaning that critical communication may actually no longer be working in a way that no one has any visibility into. You might only get anecdotal reports that things are not being received. At any rate, it is pretty clear that if we want to maintain this handover, and I know Kieran is very rightly proud about how effective a lot of these interventions have been over the years, and if we want to continue to ensure that the UK is the safest place for the government and public sector organizations to be online, then we need some sort of action to make sure this happens with some level of continuity. For anyone who's on the webinar who doesn't actually know what their current configuration is as it relates to email authentication, there are a whole bunch of free tools out there that allow you to check where you are right now, so at least you understand what the issues might be. I think Jack has linked a couple of entries in the chat that you could use from ourselves at Sift. We are available on G-Cloud 14. There are, of course, a few other options also available on G-Cloud 14, depending on your requirements. But we allow for effectively a fully managed DMARC solution via some of our partners, or if you just want software, we have subscriptions just for DMARC itself, which is give you the equivalent SaaS interface to what you would get from MailCheck, along with a whole bunch of new stuff that MailCheck never got around to implementing. There was a question specifically on certificates in PQC for SMTP. I would put those into what I call the advanced category. So these are organizations that are looking for more than just the basic MailCheck and WebCheck interfaces. We put categorized PQC as part of our certificates product. We actually have a free solution, which we launched in partnership with Let's Encrypt, which I think most of you in the PKI space probably know about. They are, if you have a small estate of certificates, that product will basically monitor your PKI estate for you, including SMTP interfaces, and understand where you are from a PQC handshake perspective. So for people who are not aware, PQC is basically post-quantum. There are now standards in place to help make sure that the key exchange is post-quantum secure and is part of what organizations need to start getting prepared for. We have tools in our interface that allow us to do this, not just for SMTP and not just for the web, but across your entire estate, including private PKI, if that is of interest. So you can look at some of the solutions that we provide beyond the DMARC space if you are already in that advanced category. Of course, for the organizations that are currently in reporting or at a low level of quarantine and you want to move to reject to be fully compliant with the best recommendations of the time, you need to start using tools like us, frankly, to start moving your digital estate forward in some way or form. Many organizations we have noticed have not deployed MTA-STS, which is the next big challenge for organizations looking to implement the standards that are recommended at the time. And of course, there is the asset inventory challenge to make sure that every asset that you are responsible for is cataloged and maintained in your system. We have solutions to help provide that on a continuous and ongoing basis. Of course, once you have all of those things in place, ensuring that you're a part of the maturity cycle, you're getting towards the end where you effectively have all of this operationalized and integrated with your workflow of choice so that exceptions can be managed, escalations can be detected by the systems, not by members of the general public complaining about delivery issues or those sorts of things. And we're quite excited that there may be solutions for organizations in the public sector who want to implement things like BIMI, which require, traditionally trademarks or certain other kinds of IP registration, which many public sector organizations, clearly wouldn't have. But there's a new standard called the CMC that we'll be doing a webinar of some point in the future, which will effectively allow organizations to use their brand and present them in a secure way inside email clients all around the world. So with all of that, I think we have a little bit of time to move to Q&A. So having a quick look through, perhaps starting with Mark's question, does your ASM tool monitor certificates? Yes, we have basically two products. One of them is around domain security posture management, which is our ASM product. And then we have a certificates product. As I said, the certificates product is specifically designed for organizations that really want to go deeper on PKI and certificates. For smaller states, as I said, it's free. If you are a Let's Encrypt user, you may have seen it. You can actually sign up for it and have a quick look around. Depending on your estate, you might hit some limits. And if you do, then just reach out to us and we're happy to discuss increasing that limit for you or moving you on to one of our commercial tiers. As I said, that supports private PKI in addition to public PKI, and our commercial product supports PKI on non-standard ports. So it's not just web, right? If you have MQTT, if you have other sorts of exotic services, we also do monitoring of that with certificates.
I see some of the other, there are bunch of questions. You've dealt with a lot of them, Rahul, which are very much about product. There's a couple that are, I think, general, which I'm quite happy to take. There's one from Eric on HMRC and taking steps to replace these services. I think what HMRC did was led the way in brand protection. They've been very, very careful about it. I think both empirically and anecdotally, the experience of the everyday Brit. I'm not saying that nobody now gets spoof emails from HMRC and that those never lead to, from the criminal point of view, successful defrauders, but it's a lot less prevalent than it used to be when it was one of the most spoofed brands. There's a really, really excellent question from Richard about the main, and I think it's justifiably slightly provocative in parts about our ASM providers cashing in on panic. So I think to take the two parts of those questions in turn, the second part, are providers cashing in on panic. I think genuinely, and you're better placed to answer this than I am, Rahul, but I think my own experience is partly relevant here. If you look at the first part of Richard's questions about the main barriers, apathy, ability, and cost, those are all barriers. So one of the checks against providers cashing in on panic is that the strong alternative provision is doing nothing. And for a lot of organizations, that's actually what they have been doing for quite a long period of time. One of the reasons why the government stepped in the first place, I think having demonstrated the utility of that, there still is a risk that too many organizations will not protect themselves properly. So, if there are concerns about, providers cashing in on panic, by all means, raise them. But I think it's quite the opposite, that actually, like a lot of cybersecurity services targeted for smaller providers, it's actually quite a hard place to operate in. And we need to do what we can to encourage, because that's to encourage smaller organizations to adopt these services, because that's key to national defense.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, Kieran. Certainly, as a provider in the space, I think certainly working for small to medium organizations, the challenge is really just getting awareness out, and that ends up being a very difficult and frankly costly thing to do for organizations, which is one of the reasons why it's quite difficult to find the right economic model for SMEs. As I said, for organizations like us, we do as much as we can to help the community. For example, the thing that we talked about briefly with Let's Encrypt, they were looking to retire some of their services that they offered for free to organizations that use their very important tooling. And they approached us and we collaborated and said, okay, we can do this sort of thing effectively for free at the scale at which they operate, because we can just about absorb the cost of actually providing this sort of functionality to the market. I think it's a challenge for vendors too, to make sure that they actually build something that is economically viable for them. And we view it as good for security and good for the network effects, which is what I'm passionate about. But also we could deliver the service in a way that we could manage the cost. I think the challenge really is just sort of making sure that there is a good degree of accountability and to some extent curiosity inside the organizations to say, if I'm going to go out there and do my research and find vendors that are fit for me, I'm actually willing to sort of follow this through and implement this into what is effectively the long grass for this.
Yeah, and I think that plays to Cormac's question about the government stepping out of this space. What role do they have in ensuring regression to previous norms doesn't happen? There are two answers to that. One you've just answered, which is at the organizational level. The public organizations themselves who've depended on this, do have a duty to the public to protect themselves as best they can. There are other options open to the central authorities. You can gather and publish, or at least circulate internally, data on best practice and so forth, and that has been a powerful tool both in cybersecurity and other parts of government as well. So I would hope and expect that they're thinking about those types of things, but ultimately each organization needs to account for themselves as well.
Okay, great. I think we're coming up on time for the webinar that we had scheduled. So once again, many thanks to Kieran for joining us.
Well, thank you.
Many thanks to everyone for listening to us. And hopefully we got through most of your questions. I know that there's still a few that are outstanding, but we will very happily follow up right after this webinar. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.